In this video, I'll explain vSphere replication and how we can use it to maintain a copy of critical data at a recovery site. And we'll also take a little time to talk about Site Recovery Manager as well. Okay, these two solutions really go hand in hand with each other. So the role of vSphere replication is to keep a current copy of our data at a remote location. And it's vendor agnostic, it's storage agnostic, so it can work with any of these types of storage shown here. Right? It can work across different storage vendors. So it's a replication tool that operates at the vSphere level, and it doesn't really matter what the underlying physical storage is. Right? So for example, you can replicate an NFS data store to a fiber channel data stored in another location. And it's all managed using the vSphere web client. We do have to roll out a vSphere replication appliance in order to configure this, and then we'll pair the two sites together and we'll replicate changed blocks to reduce the amount of traffic generated by vSphere replication. It does not support synchronous replication, meaning I can't have real-time replication of data. Right? I have a recovery point objective of at most every 15 minutes. Right? That's the most frequent interval that I can actually replicate data using vSphere replication. Right? So the recovery point objective is used to specify the amount of acceptable data loss. So when you hear RPO, we think, okay, we have an RPO of 15 minutes. That means we can lose up to 15 minutes of data if something fails. So every 15 minutes, vSphere replication will send a copy of your data to your disaster recovery site. Right? Whereas recovery time objective is a little bit different, right? That's used to determine how much downtime you can have, not how much data loss you can have. And that's where Site Recovery Manager really starts to kind of come into the picture here, is with recovery time objective. If we need to get things back up and running quickly, Site Recovery Manager is a great way to do that. Right? So two different objectives, right? We have recovery point objective, which specifies the amount of acceptable data loss, and recovery time objective, which specifies the amount of acceptable downtime. And like I mentioned, if we're going to enable vSphere replication, we have to deploy this pre-built Linux virtual appliance. We can deploy up to 10 of these per vCenter instance. And each of these is going to utilize 4 gigs of memory and between 2 and 4 virtual CPUs. So here's how it works. When you configure vSphere replication for a virtual machine, you will choose a target data store that you want to replicate the data to. Right? So in our diagram here, we see we've got a protected site. Right? This is kind of like a primary site, and then a recovery site. And we want to replicate virtual machine data to this data store that exists at our recovery site. So what's going to happen is we're going to have to make a full initial copy of all of that data. This can also be called a seed copy. And as data is written to virtual machine disks, there's something called the vSphere replication agent that runs inside of your ESXi hosts that's going to track all of those changed blocks. Right? So as virtual machine data changes, the VR agent is in your host, tracking all of those changes. And then every so often, according to your recovery point objective, now let's say it's 15 minutes for the recovery point objective, a copy of all of those changes is going to be pushed over to the destination data store. Right? And the data is actually going to flow through that vSphere replication appliance. Right? So that's the mechanism that basically allows you to transmit all of those changed blocks to the recovery site. And you can even do what's called multiple point in time instances with vSphere replication. Right? So when you configure replication for a virtual machine, you can enable multiple point in time instances. So for example, let's say that we have this protected virtual machine that is a SQL server. Right? So here's my SQL server. And some sort of data corruption has just occurred on this virtual machine. Right? It's corrupted, and that corrupted data then gets replicated, let's say 15 minutes later. Now the problem has occurred at our protected site, and all of that corrupted data has been replicated to our recovery site, so the data there is no good either. Well, by setting up these multiple point in time instances, you can recover the virtual machine from a snapshot that took place before that corruption occurred. And you can have up to 24 recovery points per replication job. So multiple point in time instances gives you an additional level of protection. All right, let's go back one slide and talk a little bit about Site Recovery Manager as well. And we're going to cover this at a really high level too. But essentially, here's what Site Recovery Manager does. We have this protected site and this recovery site. And if we're running Site Recovery Manager, we're worried about the sort of situation where we lose our entire protected site, right? So let's say we've got replication going and all of my data is being replicated from the protected site to the recovery site. So we know that we have a current copy of our data at both locations, and that's a good thing, right? We're not going to have a lot of data loss if we do have this sort of disaster type scenario. What SRM does is it automates the disaster recovery response, right? So if our protected site fails, think about all of the things that need to happen. Right? We've got all these VMs that now need to run at the recovery site. So those VMs need to get booted up on an ESXi host. They might need their IP address changed. You know, there might be database VMs or domain controllers that need to boot up first, and then other components boot up in a certain order after that. I might want to drop those VMs in different resource pools. There's all kinds of little nuances that are going to happen as I spin up all of my VMs at that recovery site. That's what SRM gives you, is the ability to cut down that recovery time objective by automating all of that stuff that needs to happen when you recover from a disaster. And it also gives you the ability to test, to test out your DR plan non-intrusively, without taking anything down at the protected site. Okay, so in this lesson, we learned about vSphere replication and how it is a vSphere-based replication solution that is managed using the vSphere web client. And we do have to deploy the VR appliance or vSphere replication appliance in order to configure this. It will send lightweight deltas, or essentially all of the changed blocks, as frequently as we've defined in the recovery point objective. So as frequently as once every 15 minutes, or it can be as infrequently as once every 24 hours.